Good morning again, Green Spring. I'm host today of the Village in Motion on Mars, and I have as guest Rich Schmidt, who's our old-time space explorer, and he has a lot of other interests that he's talked to you about on Village in Motion and other special programs. And my youngest grandson, Max Smart, who's a budding space scientist who works at NASA. So we're going to talk today about Mars and about the visits we've had to Mars and all that sort of thing. So that's going to, we had one other program on Mars that was about a year ago. We talked about going there, and we talked about how we orbited the Earth, and we orbited Mars and went down like we did to the moon. And we talked about a lot of different things about the problems of going to Mars, and why would we want to send a man to Mars when we could do all of this work on Mars with robots. So today we're going to talk a little bit about robots, but first, Max, why don't you update us on what NASA's thinking about the trip to Mars?
Sure thing. So the last time that we talked, we were still figuring out what this administration's plans were for our Mars exploration. In the past, Congress had said NASA has to go to Mars before 2040. And this administration felt like the best path forward is to go to the moon and use the moon as a jumping off point for Mars. So what that means is that we're planning on building up infrastructure around the moon, something called the Deep Space Gateway. And this would be sort of like a space station in orbit around the moon. Oh. And from that space station, we can send astronauts to the moon. We can land test articles. Basically, we can build a Mars rover and test it out on the moon in that 1/6 gravity on the moon before we send it to Mars. Mars having a lower gravity than the Earth's. The moon is a great place to test these sorts of things.
Yeah, the Mars gravity is about a third, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And also, I would assume that this orbiter is something like the International Space Station, or is it something different?
It will be similar to that sort of modular construction where we send up different pieces, put it together. We haven't exactly settled on a final look for it yet. We don't know exactly what things we'll be putting on. One thing that we do know is that we're going to be working with international partners to do this.
Okay. So this is not going to be a U.S. alone?
It is not the U.S. alone. Okay. One thing I love is that Canada is once again building the robotic arms in our Deep Space Gateway, and I suspect that anything that goes to Mars will have a Canadian-designed robotic arm. Canada did the robotic arm for the space shuttle, for the ISS, and you know they've been with us the whole way. Yeah. So I have no doubt that they'll be with us for the future.
So that's the new wrinkle right now, the idea of an orbiter around the moon from which we would work and get ready to go to Mars.
Right. So we're calling this the Moon to Mars program, or the Moon to Mars initiative. Yeah. And the idea is we're going to go to the moon as a part of getting to Mars.
So we're not going to have a station down on the moon itself.
Right.
But we will be making, like going to the grocery store. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. When you realize that, oh shoot, I left that rock down on the moon, you just pop down and then
should have that one.
Well, that's the idea, at least. One other interesting and cool thing about it is that that gateway we would open up to commercial access as well. So if a private company wanted to go to the moon and they needed a base station to launch from, we might partner with them and work with them to let them use the gateway.
That would be a different mission.
On their own missions. Yeah. If Blue Origin or SpaceX or any other Moon Express, any other moon-based company wanted to work on the moon, and we might say, yes, use our space station, and in return, we would love it if you would help us build, this, or help get us to Mars.
Yeah. There's one other thing I'd like to clear up, and that is when we get to Mars. I think when we talked about it about a year ago, we sort of had in mind that you were going to be living on Mars for a period of time, but that doesn't seem to be the idea now. Is that?
So the idea is we want to build we want to build up to living on Mars. The dream is a research station that's permanently on the surface of Mars, like Antarctica, where we always have people at the South Pole. But
that's not 2040.
right, exactly. Right now, we're just trying to make sure that we build up the technology and the capability, and then we go and we actually do it, and we don't wait until we can do it in this fantastic and amazing way. First, you have to be Roald Amundsen or or Scott. You have to get to the South Pole before you can build up a station there. Right. So our first plan is we want to go, and we're even thinking that we might even just orbit on the first time to Mars. We just fly to Mars and we orbit just like Apollo 8.
Without going down.
Without going down.
Oh.
If the landers aren't ready, if the habitat's not ready, if the rovers aren't ready, we don't want to wait. We want to go. We want to go see what it's like, and so we would. This is a possibility. Of course, if the landers are ready, if you send astronauts with working landers, there's no way they would steal the lander and just go to Mars anyway. They're not going to wait in space. But so the idea is, if they're not ready, we would still send these people out, and they would orbit Mars until the planets lined up again, and then they'd come on home.
But our first trip to Mars, where we're actually going to land on Mars, we're going to spend a short time on there, but we're going to spend a long time orbiting Mars. Is that
right? Because of the way that the planets line up, once you get to Mars, you're probably going to be sticking around for about a year and a half anyway.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to land a year and a half's worth of food on Mars. That takes a lot of landers, but it would all be waiting for you in your space station anyway. So the thought is you go and you land, you hang out on Mars for about 30 days or so, you collect all the rocks, you do the surface science, and then you fly back up to your space station where you analyze the science that you've collected and check out, make sure that everything's still working for the future.
And I think that's kind of different from what we left the impression of a year ago. At least in my mind, it's a little different.
I'm happy to clear that up.
That's why I wanted to because it's not a matter of living down there so much as it is going down, getting information, spending a little time there, and then coming back. And unfortunately, we're going to have to spend more time in space. Right. Until we can line up and get back. And it takes about 9 months to go, and it takes about 9 months to get back.
That's exactly
approximately. Maybe a few months less, a few months more. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk then. That sort of updates us on
where we're going.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's talk about what we've learned so far, because we've had a lot of missions to Mars. We started about 1960 something when we did our first flyby. We did Mariner, I think, in 64, and we flew by and we got an idea of what. And that's the first time that we realized there were no canals on Mars. Is that right?
I guess that's what was going on then. I hadn't check out the flybys. I was looking more at the robotic
the landers.
Yeah.
But we did have some flybys earlier, so we looked and saw what.
Yeah, the easy thing to do is to fly by.
Yeah.
To orbit is a little harder.
And we put an orbiter in.
And so you get some close-up pictures anyhow.
Yeah.
And you learn something about the surface that you didn't know before.
And find a place to land.
Yeah. And then finally, you try the landing.
Yeah.
And I understand the Russians got there first, but they died. One crashed and one lived for a few seconds, and that was the end of that. The really first one that was successful, really truly successful, was the Americans' Viking 1 and 2. They got down there and they lasted a long time.
And that was 1975.
75 is
which
when
was
they,
after our lunar program was finished, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had launched in 75. They got there in 76.
Yeah.
And so they started their mission, and the mission was only supposed to be like 90 days. But the design time for those robots was 4 years.
Oh.
So, 90 days doesn't sound like much, but it's really designed for 4 years. And they did last. The Viking 2 lasted 4 years, and the Viking 1 lasted 6 years.
Oh.
So they got a lot of time.
And what did we
out of it.
learn?
So one interesting thing about the Viking landers is that we were talking about, we weren't really sure what kind of things to expect on Mars. I mentioned earlier the optimism of previous eras. People were thinking canals and little green men and that sort of thing. And we quickly figured out that there weren't civilizations on Mars, but we still expected there would probably be life, at least we hoped. And then we did those flybys and took pictures, and it quickly became clear that it was just craters. But that even with that lunar-esque landscape, we still were hoping for life. And so when we sent Viking, Viking was a astrobiology mission, looking for microscopic life on Mars.
Then did Viking move? It had a little rover, didn't it?
No rover at all.
No
It
rover,
just
just
stayed there, analyzed the soil, looking
dug
for
a
this
little trench.
microbial. Yeah.
And we don't have a picture of the trench, though, do we? No.
No.
So the one interesting thing about Viking was that it was cleaned very thoroughly, because we were worried about Earth microbes infecting Mars, and Mars. We were worried about cross contamination, and then it landed and dug up very, very sterile dirt, and and since then we didn't worry so much about. I mean, we still clean our rovers and our things that we send to Mars, but Viking was like baked within an inch of its life, just to make sure that nothing made it. We worry less now.
So what did we learn from Viking?
Oh,
No life.
Yeah,
Or at least
no life.
none that we found.
Yeah.
But signs of water. I think they got the
we discovered that really there was some water in the
some
soil.
water. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first time that had happened.
And we got a chance to see the landscape, the rocks.
Yeah, it seems like pebbles were all around on the surface.
Yeah.
And but there were some big boulders too. And we didn't have another launch until 21 years later. The Pathfinder and Sojourner was sent up there. So there's a big gap between 76 and when Pathfinder got up there. It was launched in 96 and landed in 97. So in 97, we now had not just a lander, but a rover.
Yeah.
But the rover was only 23 pounds.
Do we have any pictures of that?
There should be a picture up. See if they can find that one.
That it?
That should be our second picture, I believe.
Yeah, that's the Viking there. That's shown on the screen. And this is the one that's the Pathfinder and Sojourner.
Okay.
The Sojourner is in the foreground there. That little fella is the 23-pound payload that was delivered by the Pathfinder, which is the lander. And the lander, to get there, we weren't quite sure how to get it onto the land safely, and so they used some airbags. And we have an illustration of the airbags. And when I had looked at this before, I thought those airbags were the size of a soccer ball. No, sir. If you had a person standing next to it, the person's about the size of the balls.
Is that the one with the person standing by?
I can't see
It's
the
a
picture
later
right
photo.
now.
Yeah.
So those balls are large, and but it surrounds and protects the Pathfinder and the Sojourner, which is embedded inside the lander.
So the object is that big. That each ball there is about the height of a man, about 6 foot diameter.
Yeah, about 5 feet or
So
so.
we see that on the
And the
so
idea
when it
is
hits,
when that bounces,
yeah. How high does it bounce?
it'll bounce pretty high because of the low gravity, and also you're hitting it pretty hard. They soften it as best as they can. The technique was you first slow down with retroactives. You put a retro rocket to slow down enough so you get out of orbit, and now you're slowing down, you're getting into the impact of the air, which is very thin, the thin air atmosphere of the Mars, but you still have a heat shield. And the heat shield takes that energy and absorbs the energy, slows down the vehicle to the point where you can deploy a parachute about 600 miles an hour. It's still going pretty fast.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to have a good, strong parachute. That parachute brings you down to a slower speed yet, and then they'll get rockets that'll slow it down and give you a soft landing. Well, not soft enough, so that's why we have the airbags. It hits the ground at about 30 miles an hour.
Oh.
Okay, so there's a bit
And
of
it's
a
probably coming
thrust.
in at horizontal.
Coming in horizontally about 30
yeah.
miles an hour. And it bounced 50 feet up into the air on the first bounce.
Okay.
And then it did over 16 bounces thereafter. But because it's in a equilateral type of situation, any side that it lands on, it has to be able to reorient itself to the right way to deploy the...
so there's some internal mechanism that causes it to get in a
The first thing it does is deflate the airbags.
Okay.
Now you end up on one of the sides, and it's such that it can reorient itself to the preferred side. Well, by luck, they happen to hit the preferred side.
Oh,
they didn't have
Really?
to do anything, yeah. So it ended up the right way. They open up the clamshell, and out rolls the Sojourner, which is this 23-pound package that can
Do
now
we have a picture of
rotate.
that?
Yeah, we should have had that in there too.
We don't know.
I don't know that we have a picture
Yeah,
of
we
that.
showed that before.
Okay.
And so it was supposed to,
And this is the second landing.
yeah, this is the second one, quite a few years in between, 21 years in between. But now they knew so much from the first landing that they were prepared pretty much for what was going to happen. They got stuck, though. They did hit a soft patch. One of them, let's see, I'm thinking ahead to another one. In Sojourner, I think they didn't get stuck. They were able to move about. I wonder how many miles they went. I don't.
So Sojourner didn't go very far. It
Yeah, they
stayed
went
within sight because Sojourner didn't have any cameras on it. It was basically just a little. It was a little solar panel with wheels.
Oh.
But the cool thing that Sojourner did, it did have some science sampling instruments on it. And the cool thing that Sojourner did was it was driving around on its own on another planet. And that had not happened on Mars yet.
That's the first thing that ever happened.
And so that set the precedent for, I mean, Sojourner was the first rover, but it was certainly not the last.
So we didn't have a camera on it. So
Right.
we did have a camera though on the platform.
On Pathfinder, exactly.
Yeah.
So this Pathfinder, the base station was basically keeping an eye on. It was keeping an eye on the Sojourner rover as it drove around in little circles around
Okay,
Pathfinder.
so we have Pathfinder, and it carried the rover.
Exactly.
The rover,
Right.
And the rover went down this little ramp, as I recall, and it drove around. But what we saw was pictures that were taken from the Pathfinder of the Sojourner taking its little trip.
Right.
But Sojourner was able to do some sampling, and so they got some data back from the rover itself.
Did it return to Pathfinder?
It just beamed the data back.
The data just came back. Yeah.
Okay.
They didn't have to travel back.
All right. So
Then 6.5 years later, we had Spirit and Opportunity. So there's two different spaceships that went up. They were identical, and they sent them up. And the let's see, is that the one that has an orbiter? Yeah, I think that was an orbiter and a space station, and a lander rather, and a lander with a rover. And so we had two rovers going out.
did they land in the proximity of each other, or did they land
Different areas.
different areas?
Yeah, they picked different areas to
Far
explore.
different. Yeah.
And so they get down there, and again, about 90 days is all they're supposed to last.
Oh.
But the design again is for 4 years. And let's see if I got some numbers for that. 6 years for Spirit. Spirit made it for 6 years. an opportunity.
15.
15 years. Can you imagine? That's a really long time that thing
Yeah.
lasted.
Yeah,
Well, what
for
happened to Spirit? Why didn't it last as long?
Got caught into some soft sand.
Oh, and it couldn't
And
get
it
out.
couldn't get out.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, I remember that. That's now. Yeah.
It had a couple of wheels that failed too. And one of the forward wheels failed, and so they ended up going backwards and dragging it along.
Okay.
Well, they discovered a benefit of that. As it dragged along, it took away the dust, and now they could see the surface that they hadn't seen before. So that was a benefit that was just accidental.
Well, so the dust was very thin on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
When we say the
Apparently,
surface,
yeah.
what are we really talking about? Rock?
We're talking about the rock underneath.
Yeah.
Hard pan or
Yeah.
some sort.
So you have dust on top, and it was
Yeah.
scraping away the dust.
Okay.
So they got that out of that. But then they got caught, and they couldn't get out of the final one.
Yeah.
So that ended that one. But the
And
opportunity
that was
just
6
went,
years.
Yeah, about 6 years.
How far
Still-
did it travel? Any idea?
About 4.8 miles, it says here, for the Spirit. For the opportunity, I got 28 miles.
No, we have the path, don't we? That the Spirit took.
I believe that's
Yeah.
image 14.
Yeah, that's it.
If
So we
get-
can see there the trail that it took along.
Mhm.
That's about
about
over
5
4
miles.
huh?
4 or 5
Mhm.
miles.
Okay. All right. Well, what happened to the other one, the Opportunity?
Opportunity lasted for 15 years. We actually only lost it last year, just this past summer. It launched in 2003, and we lost it in the summer of 2018 in a what we call Mars global dust storms.
Oh.
Mars has these dust storms every Martian year. It's sort of prime for dust storms. The problem is we don't know if they're going to stay localized, because sometimes these dust storms become global, and they encompass the entire planet in this dust.
So we can't forecast the Mars weather, huh?
It is not something we are
Even
ready
globally,
to do yet.
yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's something we're working on.
But can they tell when a dust storm is going to come?
So we know that dust storms are going to happen. We just don't know if they're going to become global.
Yeah.
And the global dust storms are what can knock out our rovers. They last for weeks, months even. And the sky becomes so dark that the solar panels on our rovers are no longer able to provide power, and the rovers freeze out. And once they freeze out, then they can't come back.
So Opportunity can't come back and beep, and
Right.
wake somebody up some morning.
We
Yeah,
would.
they tried it, but it didn't work.
Right. We tried for months, but
see.
in order to fix it up, I'm sure that someday people will want to go swap out the batteries and get it running again.
Yeah, maybe
But,
so. But when we get that station up,
Exactly.
it'll be like riding through the desert and finding a skull of a cow that went through there or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the
All
next
right.
one
Well,
we set
what
up
did we
there-
learn? What did we learn from Spirit and Opportunity?
Spirit.
So after Viking being that astrobiology mission, we realized that finding life on Mars would be a lot harder than we expected. So we sort of moderated our expectations, and instead we've been sampling the surface, checking like what kinds of soils we're finding, different kinds of rocks.
And are we finding different soils in just 20 miles? Or?
So over the course of Opportunity, I'm not sure. I know that Curiosity, which we'll get to,
Okay.
just found a big clay deposit
Okay.
that's very interesting for astrobiology implications. I know that one of the rovers, either Opportunity or Spirit, went to the edge of a big crater. I think it's Victoria Crater, and it is a gorgeous crater.
Oh.
So there are some phenomenal photos that came from that. But I don't know exactly. My expertise is not in geology, so I can't tell you what the geological implications of it were.
But we were restricted in what we learned. We really didn't. We learned something, but we still need to learn a lot more. Is that the idea? All right, well, so we had another one after these. Curiosity, is that the next
Yeah,
one?
Curiosity came along about 8 years after the last one. And so that was in, let's see,
2012.
2012.
2012. Yep. And that was a biggie, about a ton. And so now how are you going to get that down on the surface? Well, they invented something called a crane, a space crane or
The Sky Crane.
sky crane.
Yeah. So
It starts out the same as the others. You come down and you have your retro rockets to slow down, then you have a heat shield to slow down, then you have a parachute to slow you down. That parachute had to hit at about 800 miles an hour, so it was going a little faster than the previous one. But it slows it down, and then rockets would take over. And once the rockets take over, you release your parachute, and now you're flying this device with rockets, and then you lower down from that this sky crane, or the space crane?
So it's
the Sky Crane.
Sky crane.
Pretty
Sky
much
crane.
like the moon lander then.
It's a little different because so the moon lander landed on its legs. It had its own engine, and it landed.
This is not landing, huh?
So what the Sky Crane did was it was sort of like it was like a helicopter drop, except instead of a helicopter, it was rocket powered. So this rocket powered sort of claw flies up, and then from that rocket powered platform,
It's still, the rockets are still going.
the rockets
right?
are still firing,
Yeah.
and it's hovering in air.
Yeah.
And as it's hovering, a winch lowers the Curiosity rover, so that the rockets never come close to the ground.
They didn't want the rockets to blow up all the dust.
Yeah.
So they have the rockets up high enough, and then with the winch lowering it down onto the surface.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So it was.
You know, the idea that we can do that, you know, it's incredible.
Then they release that, and the rockets fly away, and you're on the surface with the
And
opportunity.
it crashed over some
Right.
Yeah.
a few
Nearby.
miles away, probably. Yeah.
And the orbiter could see that.
Yeah.
The orbiter
Oh,
would
is that
take,
right?
Yeah, the orbiters took images and saw where it was.
Of what happened to
Of the Sky
Yeah.
Crane wreckage.
Yeah.
Oh, Bernard. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was good.
So this is a bigger,
Yeah, this is a big fella. He's like a SUV,
yeah.
that type of size.
And it's when we got the opportunity, we realized that this was big enough that we could use what we call an RTG. It's a nuclear. It's a chunk of plutonium that produces heat and energy on its own, and so it doesn't have to rely on solar panels. It's a nuclear-powered rover.
Yeah.
And the advantage of that is that when this global dust storm hit last year, while Opportunity was its solar panels were choked out and it could not power itself, the Curiosity rover could just keep on trucking.
Yeah.
And the Viking used the same technique. It had nuclear, the same kind of a power source
that
was
right?
on Viking. Yeah.
So what did we learn from Curiosity? It's been working now about 7 years. 6 years.
So Curiosity has done a lot of really great work. We have found Curiosity has been driving around the basin of a large crater called Gale Crater, and it's climbing a mountain inside that crater called Mount Sharp. The Curiosity rover is sampling soils and looking for astrobiological signs. And has actually had some great success in that regard. We've found a lot of building blocks that we think might, essentially we think that this crater was once filled with water. And so we've found chemicals in the soil that tell us that this water may have once held the building blocks of life. And so if you put water and building blocks of life here on Earth, you get life.
So and we've got a lot more to learn from Curiosity, I'm sure. And how far has Curiosity traveled? About
I don't know off the top of my head.
It gets around though much easier, I presume, than the others and further.
It is a bit larger and a bit faster, I believe.
Well, we've had another more recent one, Insight, but we're going to have to wait till another time to talk about that, because although we have a lot of insight into these programs, we don't necessarily know exactly how long it's going to take us.
Exactly.
So we're just about out of time. But you know, it's been very interesting to me to talk about these, and I think you know, I remember them as they happened. But the problem is, they happen. You see something in the paper, but then you don't get to see anything more unless you tune into the NASA channel. And the NASA channel in our system is 352, and I frequently go to sleep at night flying from the ISS, overlooking the Earth, you know, and it's just a very calming effect to be able to do that. Well, thank you all very much for coming and talking about Mars. And our next program, I think we're going to do one maybe in October, and maybe we'll have some information on Insight, but I'd like to talk about some of the other flybys that we've done, you know, Saturn flyby, and those some of those that were very, very interesting.
For sure.
Cassini, wasn't it? And some of the others. I know that Rich had one on landing on a piece of rock out there. That was a fun one.
I do love Mars, but there are many great planets out there.
Yeah, we've got billions, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all very much again.
Of course.